I need to tell you something right now that might change everything about how you see your spiritual journey. If you've been feeling completely drained of motivation since your awakening, like you're just drifting through life with no drive, you're not broken, you're not failing. What you're experiencing has a name and almost nobody talks about it. Stay until the end because the final insight I'm going to share completely transformed how I understand spiritual growth, and it might be exactly what you need to hear right now. Hidden pattern. Let me ask you something deeply personal. Do you remember how excited you were when you first experienced that spiritual breakthrough? That moment when everything seemed to click into place. The universe made sense. You felt connected to something larger. Your purpose seemed clear. And now, nothing. The fire is gone. The motivation that once drove you to meditate for hours, to study ancient texts, to transform your life, it's vanished like morning mist. You're wondering if you've done something wrong, if you've somehow failed at spirituality. Some days, you can barely get out of bed, let alone pursue your spiritual practice with the same fervor. I know this feeling intimately. I've walked this path, and what I've discovered is that this isn't a sign of failure. It's actually a critical phase of true spiritual development that nobody prepared you for. The ancient Taoist masters had a name for this stage, but it's been largely forgotten in our quick-fix spiritual culture that's obsessed with constant elevation and good vibes only. Energy shift. What's really happening inside you is a fundamental reconfiguration of how energy moves through your being. Before your awakening, your motivation was fueled by external validation, by the thrill of discovery, by the identity of being someone who is spiritual. Your ego, yes, your ego, was actually driving much of your spiritual seeking. Then something profound happened. You glimpsed something beyond the ego. You touched a truth that transcends the self-improvement project. And in that moment, whether you realized it or not, the old motivational structures began to dissolve. This is what the Taoists called sitting in the void, the necessary emptying that must occur before authentic action can emerge. But here's where our modern understanding fails us. We've been conditioned to believe that motivation should be constant, that passion should never wane, that we should always be striving, achieving, becoming. This is the language of capitalism, not spirituality. This is the mindset of acquisition, not awakening. What if I told you that this absence of motivation isn't something to fix, it's something to fully experience? What if this emptiness is actually a purification of your intentions? What if this void is the very soil from which your authentic purpose will eventually grow? Cultural blindness. In the West, we've inherited a spiritual paradigm that's still fundamentally goal-oriented. Even when we think we've escaped the achievement mindset, we're often just repackaging it in spiritual language. Manifesting abundance, achieving enlightenment, becoming awakened. Notice the verbs. They're all about doing, getting, becoming. This is why we panic when motivation disappears. We've been taught that without striving, we're nothing. Without progress, we're failing. This mindset is so deeply ingrained that we don't even question it. We just desperately try to rekindle the fire that drove us before. But consider this. What if the disappearance of that old motivation is the very sign that your awakening was genuine? What if this emptiness is not an obstacle to your spiritual path, but the path itself unfolding exactly as it should? Shiheng Yi, the Shaolin master whose teachings have profoundly influenced my understanding of this stage, describes it as the necessary death before rebirth. In the Shaolin tradition, they recognize that true spiritual development isn't linear. It moves in cycles of expansion and contraction, of action and stillness, of motivation and its absence. Evolutionary purpose. From an evolutionary perspective, this loss of motivation makes perfect sense. Think about it. Throughout most of human history, our motivation was simple and survival-based. Find food, stay safe, reproduce. Our neurological reward systems evolved to reinforce behaviors that kept us alive in immediate, tangible ways. But spiritual awakening introduces something entirely new into this ancient system. Suddenly, we're pursuing goals that aren't tied to survival. We're seeking states of consciousness that don't provide immediate evolutionary advantages. We're questioning the very identity that our brain evolved to protect. Is it any wonder that our motivational systems short-circuit, They simply weren't designed for this kind of pursuit. This isn't a flaw in you. It's a natural limitation of our evolutionary heritage that we're all trying to transcend. When motivation disappears after awakening, it's often because you've outgrown the neurological reward systems that drove you before. Your brain doesn't know how to reward you for ego dissolution. It doesn't have pre-installed pathways to reinforce transcendent awareness. It's like trying to run advanced software on outdated hardware. Something has to give. Shadow emergence. Here's another layer that few spiritual teachers address honestly. Awakening often triggers the emergence of shadow material. When you experience even a glimpse of higher consciousness, it creates a contrast that makes your unresolved wounds, traumas, and limiting patterns more visible than ever before. This shadow emergence can be profoundly depleting. Suddenly, you're not just navigating a spiritual path. You're also processing grief you've carried since childhood, examining relationship patterns you've been blind to for decades, questioning career choices that now feel misaligned with your authentic self. Your energy, which previously might have been channeled into spiritual practices, is now being diverted to this critical inner work. This isn't a detour from the spiritual path. It is the spiritual path, but it often doesn't feel sacred or elevated. It feels messy, exhausting, and anything but motivating. I remember sitting across from my teacher, tears streaming down my face, confessing that I couldn't even bring myself to meditate anymore, the very practice that had been my anchor for years. I expected him to offer techniques to rekindle my spiritual desire. Instead, he smiled and said something I'll never forget. Good. Now the real meditation can begin. Identity dissolution. Let's go deeper into what's really happening here. Before awakening, your sense of self, your identity, likely included the role of seeker. You were someone in pursuit of spiritual growth. This identity gave your ego something to hold on to, some way to maintain control of the process. But genuine awakening begins to dissolve these identity structures. The boundary between seeker and sought, between the one who meditates and the object of meditation, starts to blur. And here's the critical point. Without a solid someone who is pursuing spirituality, the conventional forms of motivation begin to collapse. Think about it. Motivation, as we typically understand it, requires a motivated subject, you, and a desired object or outcome. But awakening gradually erodes this fundamental duality. As the separate self begins to be recognized as an illusion, the whole structure of desire and motivation based on that separate self naturally falls away. This is why trying to get your motivation back after a genuine awakening can feel like trying to re-enter a house you've already outgrown. Something in you knows there's no going back to the old motivational paradigm. A new way of being is trying to emerge, but it doesn't operate on the fuel of personal desire in the way you're accustomed to. Essential surrender. This brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive truth of the spiritual path. Progress often requires surrender rather than striving. Advancement sometimes looks like letting go rather than acquiring more. Growth can manifest as a reduction rather than an expansion. In practical terms, this means that fighting against this lack of motivation might be exactly the wrong approach. When you push against this state, desperately trying to recapture your former enthusiasm, you're actually resisting the very transformation that wants to occur. Instead, the invitation is to fully enter this unmotivated state, to become intimate with the emptiness, to allow yourself to not know what comes next. This is what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, a state of not knowing that paradoxically contains profound wisdom. I spent nearly 2 years in this desert of motivation. For someone who had always been driven, always had a clear sense of purpose, it was excruciating. My meditation practice became sporadic. My spiritual reading gathered dust. Even basic self-care felt monumentally difficult some days. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, something started to shift. Not because I forced it, but precisely because I stopped forcing anything at all. I surrendered to the emptiness, not as a strategic spiritual technique, but because I had no other choice. I had tried everything else. Subtle rebirth. What emerged from this period wasn't a return of my old motivation. It was something altogether different, a way of moving through life that wasn't driven by the familiar pushes and pulls of desire and aversion. Actions began to arise naturally, without the sense of a separate self-making decisions and pursuing outcomes. The ancient wisdom traditions have many names for this state. Wu Wei in Taoism, often translated as non-doing or effortless action. Sahaja in Hindu Tantra, meaning spontaneous or natural. Shenjing in Chan Buddhism, referred to as divine stillness in action. This isn't a state of perpetual bliss or constant inspiration. It's subtler than that. Some days still feel flat. Some moments still feel empty. But underneath those surface fluctuations is a quiet current of aliveness that isn't dependent on feeling motivated in the conventional sense. Practical navigation. So what does this mean for you, practically speaking, if you're in this unmotivated phase right now? How do you navigate daily life when the fire that once drove you has seemingly gone out? First, recognize that this state has value. It's not something to rush through or fix. It's a necessary recalibration of your entire system. Just as a caterpillar must become completely liquefied inside the chrysalis before it can reconstruct itself as a butterfly, you too are in a process of deep transformation that requires a kind of temporary dissolution. Second, simplify your spiritual practice. During this phase, elaborate rituals or intensive practices often feel impossible to maintain. Instead, turn toward extreme simplicity. Perhaps it's just sitting quietly for 5 minutes each morning. Perhaps it's taking 3 conscious breaths when you remember throughout the day. Perhaps it's simply noticing the sensations in your body as you wash the dishes or walk to your car. Third, pay attention to what naturally draws you now, not what you think you should be drawn to, not what used to inspire you, but what actually calls to you in this moment. It might be spending time in nature. It might be creative expression that has no spiritual agenda whatsoever. It might be service to others in simple, practical ways. These natural inclinations, however ordinary they might seem, are breadcrumbs leading you toward your authentic expression. Fourth, find community that understands this phase. One of the most painful aspects of the post-awakening motivation crash is the feeling that you're somehow doing spirituality wrong. Surrounding yourself with others who have navigated this territory, who don't try to fix you or push you back into performative spirituality, can be profoundly supportive. And finally, practice radical self-compassion. The inner critic often becomes deafening during this phase, constantly comparing your current state to past spiritual heights or to idealized images of enlightened beings who never seem to struggle with motivation. This critical voice is not your ally on the path. Treating yourself with the same compassion you would offer to a dear friend navigating this difficult terrain is not just nice, it's necessary for the unfolding that wants to happen. Cyclical wisdom. Another framework that has helped me understand this process comes from cyclical wisdom traditions that honor the seasons, the lunar cycles, and the natural rhythms of expansion and contraction. In these paradigms, periods of seeming dormancy aren't seen as problems, they're recognized as essential phases in any natural cycle. Think of a garden. There are times for planting, times for active tending, times for harvesting, but there are also times when the soil needs to lie fallow. In traditional agricultural societies, farmers understood that forcing the land to produce continuously would eventually deplete it completely. Allowing fields to rest wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. Your spiritual life follows similar patterns. The post-awakening motivation crash can be seen as a necessary fallow period. Nothing seems to be happening on the surface, but deep in the soil of your being, crucial processes are underway. In many indigenous traditions, winter, the season of apparent death and dormancy, is honored as a time of deep replenishment. The visible signs of life may disappear, but underneath the frozen ground, roots are gathering strength. The apparent absence of growth is precisely what enables future flourishing. What if your current lack of motivation is actually your spiritual winter? Not a failure of practice, not a regression, but a natural and necessary season that carries its own unique gifts if you're willing to receive them. Motivation reimagined. As we begin to wrap up this exploration, I want to offer a completely different way of thinking about motivation itself, one that might help you navigate this confusing terrain. The word motivation comes from the Latin movere, meaning to move. At its root, motivation is simply about movement. What moves you, what causes you to act. In our achievement-oriented culture, we've come to understand motivation almost exclusively as a feeling, a sense of enthusiasm or drive that precedes action. But what if motivation isn't primarily a feeling at all? What if true motivation is simply alignment with what is genuinely yours to do in this moment? What if action can arise not from emotion, but from a clear seeing of what's needed now? This is the kind of motivation that can emerge after the post-awakening desert, a quiet clarity that doesn't depend on emotional enthusiasm. It's action that flows from being rather than from wanting. It's movement that arises naturally when the separate self is no longer desperately trying to achieve or become. I'm not suggesting that you'll never feel excited or passionate again. Those emotions will still arise, but they'll no longer be the primary fuel for your actions. Instead, you'll find yourself moved by something deeper and more stable, what some traditions call the still, small voice within. Transformed presence. One of the most beautiful descriptions of this state comes from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna instructs Arjuna, "You have the right to work, but never to the fruit of work." This isn't a prescription for joyless duty, it's a description of freedom. When actions arise without attachment to their outcomes, when movement happens without the burden of the ego's agenda, there's a lightness and ease that conventional motivation can never provide. In this state, you may find yourself doing many of the same things you did before, meditating, studying wisdom teachings, serving others. But the quality of these actions would be fundamentally different. They'll no longer be means to an end, steps on a ladder to some future enlightened state. They'll be expressions of what you already are, movements of the whole rather than strategies of the separate self. This shift is subtle but profound. It's the difference between pushing the river and flowing with it. It's the distinction between attachment to outcome and commitment to process. It's the contrast between effortful striving and effortless allowance. And paradoxically, this shift often leads to greater effectiveness in the world. When actions arise from this clear, unburdened place, they tend to be more precisely attuned to what's actually needed. There's less wasted energy, less friction, less of the exhaustion that comes from constantly swimming upstream against the current of reality. Final insight. We've covered a lot of ground, but I want to leave you with the insight that changed everything for me. The understanding that finally allowed me to make peace with my post-awakening motivation crash and discover what lay beyond it. Here it is. The disappearance of your old motivation isn't a problem to solve. It's an invitation to discover what moves you when you're no longer moved by the separate self's agenda. Let that sink in for a moment. Your spiritual awakening didn't kill your motivation. It revealed that what you've been calling motivation was actually a complex mixture of social conditioning, ego-driven desires, fear-based striving, and genuine alignment. Now you're being invited into a purification process where everything that doesn't arise from your authentic core is falling away. Yes, this process can feel like death. In many ways, it is a death, the death of an old way of being. But it's not the end of the story. It's the necessary clearing that precedes a more authentic expression of who you truly are. This doesn't mean you'll never struggle again. It doesn't mean you'll float through life in a perpetual state of blissful detachment. The human journey continues with all its messiness and challenge, but underneath the surface play of circumstances and emotions, you'll increasingly find yourself rooted in something that doesn't depend on feeling motivated in the conventional sense. You'll discover action that arises from presence rather than from the absence of something you're trying to fill. You'll experience purpose that flows from being rather than from seeking. You'll know a peace that doesn't depend on perpetual inspiration or constant progress. So if you're in that desert right now, if your motivation has vanished and you're questioning everything, know that you're not lost. You're exactly where you need to be. The emptiness you're experiencing isn't empty at all. It's pregnant with possibility. It's full of the potential for a way of being that you can't imagine from where you stand now. Your task isn't to force yourself back into the old motivational paradigm. It's to stay present with what is, to tend to what arises naturally, and to trust the intelligence of the process that's unfolding through you. Not because it will get you somewhere else, but because this presence itself is the gift that your awakening has made possible. The motivation you're seeking isn't ahead of you. It's beneath you, behind you, all around you. It's in the very ground of your being, waiting to be discovered when all the frantic searching finally comes to rest. And in that rest, something entirely new can begin.